Marvin Rappaport here, member of the Local History Committee of the Ethelbert B. Crawford Library, joined today by a couple of other members of that committee, Lynn Skolnick, who was a longtime president of the library, Alan Barish, who was a longtime director of the library. And we have the privilege today of doing what I guess we're going to call part two of the history of Monticello and Sullivan County by John Conway, who is the Sullivan County historian. John, just to remind our listeners that there is another recording that they can find of part one from the beginning of Monticello in the early 1800s through the end of the century, in which you talk to us about the history of the county and the community up to and through the Civil War. And then after that, how timber, tanning, and tourism dominated the industry here in the county. So we recommend for those who have not check that out and then come back and join us for today, when we're going to look at mostly the second century of Monticello and surrounding areas, because it was impacted by things like the airport and the racetrack and Woodstock and so forth, all of which are not in Monticello, but affected life in Monticello and the Sullivan County. So I will say hello to John, and then we'll ask him a question to start us off. John, thanks for joining us again.
Well, it's always a pleasure, Marvin. I'm glad to be here and glad to have the opportunity to talk about Sullivan County history, which is always something I like to do.
So why don't you tell us, John, what it was like in the early 1900s? Let's agree to hold off on the Silver Age, as you call it, and the Golden Age, about the Borscht Belt development, the history of resorts in the county, and talk about some of the other things that took over in the early part of the century, how the life changed here from the 1800s into the early 1900s. And then over time, perhaps we can find out about large business called Sin Flor, a perfume operation in Monticello, the phase out of the railroads, the coming of the Quickway, the racetrack, Monticello Raceway, that is, the Sullivan County Community College, Woodstock, et cetera, et cetera. John, where do you want to start us off?
Well, I guess we could start chronologically if we talk about the early 20th century. I think the history of Sullivan County is a history of transitions. And there was a great transition underway as we entered the 20th century. And I think that's probably true of the country as a whole. But examining Sullivan County is kind of a microcosm of that. We see that silver age of tourism that you mentioned is beginning to sort of fade away. The railroads have changed everything in the country, really, but certainly in the county. But I think as we get into the 20th century, we're beginning to see them lose their significance to some extent. But I think the largest or most significant transition in terms of Monticello and Sullivan County is probably the arrival of the Jewish immigrants into the county from New York City. And we begin to see this in earnest as we progress through the early years of the 20th century. And the impact that they will have on the village of Monticello and on the resort industry in particular, I think is immeasurable. So probably if we're talking about a single factor in the transition, it's the arrival of those Jewish families into the county that I think changed.
And what prompted them to come up? Was that also in the time when they were looking for fresh air in the country, or
yeah, I think primarily
Europe?
I think primarily it's about the overpopulation of New York City, the toll that it took on their health, living in squalor in the city, and the oppressive environment there. And I think many of them were seeking healing or at least a better way of life, and they came to the mountains, primarily on the railroad at that point in time. And again, as we talked last time, I think a lot of it had to do with the proximity of the origin of the O&W Railway to the Garment District in New York City. So they were familiar somewhat with Weehawken, New Jersey, and they took the train to Sullivan County, and many of them were able to purchase property here. Our economy began to struggle as we get into the 20th century, and I think they took advantage of that. And farms and resorts, but also businesses begin to be to change ownership, and they begin to be taken over by these Jewish families that have come up. Don't forget, the village of Monticello suffered a huge fire in 1909 that I think, obviously devastated Broadway and probably led to the changeover in some businesses. A second fire followed in 1919 that destroyed another part of Broadway. And when the business district of Monticello is reborn, I think it's largely reborn with Jewish merchants in place of the old time merchants. I'm not sure exactly why or how that happened, but I think that's a fact. So if we're talking about changes, I think it's the arrival of the Jews that is the primary change in the early 20th
Yeah, I
century.
can attest to that out of personal experience. My grandparents, Isidore and Esther Rappaport, came up in about 1920, had a farm on Maplewood Road, but of course took in boarders like everybody else. And they kept that farm through the Depression when they lost it and then moved into Monticello. But that experience was quite common as far as them telling us other families that they knew. Max Yasgur lived down the road. Vic Gordon and his family lived down the road. Everybody was kind of close-knit community in those early years.
I think between 1905 and 1920, we see this great change take place, certainly in the corridor along the O&W.
Yeah, and but when you think about it, you might think that everybody came to Monticello to the train station on St. John Street, but wasn't Hurleyville the primary stop at that time? Then called what, Luzon Station?
Well, it becomes Luzon Station in 1903. Prior to that, it's just Hurleyville. But keep in mind that the Monticello is not linked to the O&W until after the O&W purchases the Monticello and Port Jervis in 1903 and begins to restructure their routes, and Monticello then becomes part of the O&W by way of that branch. But prior to that, Monticello was kind of isolated from the O&W. And yes, if you wanted to come into the village, you'd either get off in South Fallsburg or Hurleyville, and you'd have to find some conveyance. And there were attempts to create trolleys between Monticello and South Fallsburg. Right-of-ways were purchased in the early 1900s, and kind of one of the great links that I have with Alan Barish. Alan produced the deed from his family's home that was originally part of my great-grandfather's farm, and part of that was a right-of-way that was granted to the trolley line that was proposed between Monticello and South Fallsburg. It ran through there, and there were actually clearing and lines rail lines were run, the remnants of which I think remained. You could still see the right of way when you travel along Route 42 between Monticello and South Fallsburg. So you're right about the Hurleyville connection. That changes after 1903 when Monticello becomes part of the O&W route.
What was the industry in the early, let's say, 30s and 40s before the hotels became quite so prominent, if any? I mean, we've never had real industry, as it were. When did Synflor arrive in Monticello, and what was that?
Yeah, I'm not exactly sure of the exact year, but there was a man by the name of Alois von Isakovics who brought Synflor to to Sullivan County, I think in the early 20th century. And you're right, there wasn't much in the way of industry here. After the tanning industry dies, we really don't have much in the way of industry. Tourism supplants it. And once tourism becomes our primary industry, which, you know, as you mentioned, takes place in the 19th century, and then the Silver Age kind of burns itself out, and the economy plummets because we don't have anything to take its place. So tourism remains the number one industry. And I think once it establishes itself, there's a concerted effort to keep other industries out. So we don't see the rise of other industries. Tourism remains the primary industry, and the hotel keepers, the major hotel keepers, I think, conspired to keep other industries out of the area for a number of reasons. They didn't want it to spoil their business. They didn't want competition for the labor market. They didn't want to drive wages up through that competition. So once we get into the 20th century, there's no industry to speak of in Sullivan County. There are lots of smaller industries, I suppose, but nothing to rival tourism.
What was Synflor?
Synflor was a chemical plant which specialized in fragrances, and eventually signed contracts with some major companies. I think Johnson & Johnson and Nestle, and they create the fragrances that are identified with a lot of the products that we know, whether it's Johnson's baby powder or some of the Nestle confections, I suppose. So von Isakovics starts it, and his son-in-law, eventual son-in-law, Louis de Hoyos the first, who he comes here from Spain, and eventually takes over Synflor, and then his son runs it after him. It's a major employer in the village of Monticello, and I suppose has a national renown for its fragrances. Really kind of a small family-run operation for most of its life. I think eventually it's owned by Nestle, if I'm not mistaken, eventually. But for most of its life, it's family owned by the von Isakovics and de Hoyos families.
Both de Hoyos men become mayors, do they not?
Yes, absolutely. And of course, the elder Louis de Hoyos was chairman of the Republican Party in Sullivan County. He was county chairman for quite a long time, and I think arguably the most powerful politico in the county for much of his life. Had a bit of a national renown. He was known as the LaGuardia of the Catskills, and the New York Times loved to run stories about him. And he was a master at marketing himself and the county, and particularly the village of Monticello, the garden spot of the mountains, he called it. So yeah, he was a real character, and much of the history of Monticello during his political career, I think, was devoted to trying to defeat him and get him out of office, and they eventually succeed. They do defeat de Hoyos, but he gets the last laugh, and he does win re-election after he's defeated, and he dies shortly after he's reelected as mayor. So I think all told, he's mayor for 12 or 14 years, perhaps. Not consecutively. There's at the very end, there's a 2-year gap where Dr. Charles Soames defeated de Hoyos as mayor. And then, of course, later, as we get into the 60s, his son is mayor of Monticello as well, and also fairly powerful political force in the county. I don't think quite to the extent that his father was, but pretty powerful nonetheless.
Does that lead us up to the 50s and late 50s with the arrival of the Quickway. All I know is growing up, people used to say it was a day trip from New York, even with car, going through all the small roads and
Sure.
old Route 17, stopping at the Red Apple, there was hours and hours. And on a weekend when there was traffic, it was like, 8-10 hours or whatever. At some point, the powers that be decided we needed a super highway in those days. How did
Yeah,
that
and
work?
it took about 30 years to get that built. The hotel people realized once the automobile replaces the railroad as the principal means of getting to the mountains, Route 17, or the Liberty Highway, as it was known for many years, is just inadequate. It just doesn't serve the purposes. And of course, it's constructed in such a way that there are massive hills, which in the early days of the automobile were problematic. Cars overheated, brakes overheated. In the hot summer, you were, which of course, when you had 2 lanes of traffic, created problems of its own because a car would stall, or there would be accidents because brakes failed because they overheated. And now the lane is closed, and what do? Traffic stops. Marvin, I think you're probably old enough to remember more so than I do, when they would create 3 lanes out of 2 in order to try to alleviate some of the traffic congestion. So on Friday, when everybody was coming up to the mountains in the summertime, they would, by way of traffic cones, they would have 2 lanes coming into Sullivan County and 1 lane going back. And then on Sunday, they would reverse it. I grew up in Rock Hill on what became Old 17, but in the early years of my life, my earliest memories are when that was the main road. And in the summertime, without exaggeration, it could take you 45 minutes to get out of your driveway to get into traffic to make the trip from Rock Hill to Monticello. So you'd be sitting in your driveway waiting to break into traffic, particularly on a Friday or a Sunday.
And wasn't Wurtsboro Hill a particular choke point in the winter weather?
Yeah, exactly. Because both coming up and going down were problematic. Coming up, a lot of cars overheated. And then going down the mountain, a lot of brakes overheated. So, there are lots of stories that people tell, and I don't remember this myself, but kids, making money by toting water out to the roadway and either throwing it on people's brakes to cool them down or pouring it into the radiators to try to alleviate overheating problems in that way. So yeah, Wurtsboro Mountain was tough, and it became obvious early on that there was a need for a more modern highway, and eventually what we called the Quickway is constructed. But as I said, it took 30 years to get that construction underway, and then probably a good 10 years to complete the Quickway all the way through Sullivan County.
Right.
It was built in sections, and the Monticello bypass is completed in 58.
Mm-hmm.
But there are sections north of us, going toward Roscoe that are not constructed until the early 60s.
Yeah, when I was on the debate team in high school and we used to go upstate, we'd get into what they called a carryall, which is like a van. And we were on the Quickway, but came to Livingston Manor or Roscoe. We got off and got on this 2-lane highway and, curvy roads all the rest of the way to Binghamton or wherever we happened to go debating. But it was as late as 63 and, it hadn't been completed. So that led to the creation of the racetrack in part, did it not?
Well, not directly, but they did sort of happen contemporaneously. The hotels, I think, as we begin to see the hotels struggling as we get into the late 1950s. And I think people don't really understand this because they remember the hotels as being, a major part of our life into the 1970s. But we can go back as we get into the later part of the 1950s, we begin to see signs of the resort industry struggling, and they thought the Raceway was a way to salvage that business, to kind of redirect it a little bit, to create another attraction for people. And the Raceway was started by a group of hotel owners who thought this was a way to complement their business. So in June of 1958, the Raceway opens. And again, few people seem to realize that it was a major disappointment for several years when it opened. The projections that were done that gave people hope that the Raceway would be a huge success were never met. People just didn't go. It was very common whenever a feasibility study was done for any enterprise like the Raceway or the Empire State Music Festival. People saw the vast numbers of visitors that came to the area, and they thought, how could something not be successful when you have all these people living in close proximity or staying in close proximity? But they failed to take into account the notion of the Fortress Hotel, which, as we get into the late 50s, becomes more and more common in Sullivan County as the smaller hotels begin to close and to struggle and to become less popular. People are looking for more modern places to vacation, and the Fortress Hotel, which is a hotel that is supplying basically all of the amenities, so that the guests are not leaving the hotel grounds to go into the community. They're not seeking entertainment or food elsewhere. Everything's provided on the hotel grounds. So the Raceway, for example, found out the hard way that people were not going to leave dinner and a show to go to the Raceway, pay a separate admission charge when they've already paid for their meals and their entertainment at the hotels. They weren't going to do that. So the Raceway suffered. They tried moving their post time back later in the evening so that people could finish dinner. But it was problematic until we get into the 60s. And I think Leon Greenberg sort of gets the idea to bring ancillary attractions to the track, and that really kind of turns it around a bit, I think.
Yeah, two things in that connection. One is that if you want to know how a proposed venture cannot succeed, ask the people who invested in Cimarron City, which of course was in the late 50s, and everybody thought
perfect
it would
example.
be a huge success, and it sort of bubbled up and then fizzled. But the racetrack, especially when Leon Greenberg was there, we used to see 10,000 people for day racing on Saturday with entertainment. And then it would clear out, and I think it was only $2 a person to get in the track. And then 10,000 people would come in the evening. So you'd have 20,000 people, some of whom were the same, in a given day. And then I worked in town at Kaplan's at that point, and other restaurants as well. 12 o'clock midnight, we'd have hundreds upon hundreds of people coming into Monticello for a corned beef sandwich at midnight.
Yeah,
and that was the case. The other part I wanted to add is, I think what also happened, John, and you didn't get to this yet, maybe, that's when the effort in the late 50s to winterize, quote unquote. We had no buildings that were heated at our hotel, the Delano. Oh, my granddad, by the way, when the racetrack opened, would stand in the front of the dining room, and when he'd see 2 or 3 guys sort of heading out around 7:30 after a quick dinner, he'd stop them and say, "You can't go. I'm paying for entertainment tonight. I don't care. You can't go to the racetrack. Get back. Come on back and sit down. We'll finish our dinner." So that was his way of, I don't know about intimidating, but at least approaching people and trying to get them to stay. But winterizing became a key issue, and we had a small hotel, and we never went for that big plunge for the indoor pool, which changed, and that helped, I think, to lengthen the season and to also keep people there in all kinds of weather. I mean, in the summer, I can remember, being at the hotel, and if it rained, my grandfather was miserable. He'd pull his hair out because everybody sat in the lobby. But when you have an indoor pool or an indoor ice skating rink, plenty to keep people happy. So that's
Also put a lot of hotels out of business, though, Marvin.
It did indeed. Making that investment, or not making the investment, as was in our case, it just lost that business to the larger places like Kutcher's, Conway, Raleigh, etc.
I think you were damned if you did and damned if you didn't, because a lot of hotels couldn't really afford the investment, and they either went bankrupt because they made the investment, or they were put out of business because they didn't. But if you think about it, it was often explained this way: if you invest in a indoor pool or an indoor skating rink, there's no way really to recoup that investment unless you increase your rates. And then a lot of the people who have been coming there for years and years, you're pricing them out. So, if you add 25 rooms on, the investment will eventually pay for itself because you have more rooms to sell, even if you don't increase your rates. You put in an indoor pool, indoor skating rink, you're not increasing your revenue unless you raise your rates. And that became this catch-22 that signaled the demise of many, many hotels. We had 40 indoor pools at one time in Sullivan County. That's a pretty huge number, but when you compare that to the 538 hotels that existed here during the height of the golden age, it's a very small fraction of the hotels that invested in indoor pools. A lot of the small hotels went out of business because they couldn't invest in indoor pools. They had either spent their money putting in private baths in the rooms, or maybe they couldn't even make that investment, and people stopped coming because Americans didn't want to vacation that way anymore. And again, we talked about last time how Americans' vacation taste changed, and we didn't always keep pace with that. And I think that was a major factor in the demise of tourism in the county.
Well, we were going to do it later. It's hard not to ask you now. What were the reasons why the hotels, the 3 A's or whatever the acronym is? Tell us about how the industry changed, in addition to what you've described as to some of the financial aspects of it.
Well, as we kind of touched on it last time about the evolution of tourism and the Silver Age and the Golden Age. So just to recap that, the Silver Age lasts from roughly 1890 to 1915, and the Golden Age is from roughly 1940 to 1965. And they're very, very different from one another in almost every way. The hotels look different. They're marketed differently. The clientele is different. The ownership is different. And in between, in the 25 years in between, there's that great transition that I referenced earlier. So we see the influx of Jewish families into the area who purchase a lot of those struggling Silver Age hotels that have either closed down or are struggling to the point where they're for sale cheap. They buy farms that are for sale cheap because the farmers are struggling because they had depended on boarders to help make ends meet. And we see this great transition into a totally different kind of resort where we're no longer marketing the natural beauty of the area. The Golden Age is not based on natural beauty. And I think the Concord is a great example of that. Concord's located on Kiamisha Lake, which is one of the most picturesque bodies of water that we have in the county. But the Concord didn't utilize the lake really to any extent. They never used it in their marketing. It was all about a man-made environment. It was about, what did we build? And when Eric was great at constantly building things, I read a comment that Dave Levinson, who owned the Tamarack Hotel, once made about Arthur Winerick, who owned the Concord. And he said when the hotel owners got together, they were all constantly talking about the construction projects they had just completed. I just completed a new dining room. I just completed 25 additional rooms. We just built an indoor pool. And he said, Arthur Winerick never talked about the construction project that he had just completed. He was always talking about what he had just started. I just started building indoor tennis courts, or I just started building whatever it was. He was always building, where other people were always talking about what they had just completed. So the Concord had this massive growth. It goes really, there is no Concord until 1935 when Eric takes over. And it's a fairly small hotel, certainly not one of the largest hotels. The Laurels is the largest hotel in as late as 1962 or 3, and Grossinger's is second. And, all of a sudden by 1964, 65, the Concord's twice as big as anyone else. So it's a massive growth spurt for the Concord. It changed everything. The other hotels are left kind of, trying to keep up with Grossinger's and the Concord. It was always this arms race, so to speak, among the hotels. But
excuse me, John, for 1 second.
Sure.
You mentioned that in between the Silver and the Golden Age is when there was an influx of Jews who bought up some of the small properties. Where did they get the money for those purchases?
Well, as I said, first of all, they were able to buy properties pretty cheaply. With the Grossinger story, I think is a great story. They buy the Longbrook, their first property in Sullivan County, for $450. So, I think if you do the calculation, that's tens of thousands of dollars today, I guess. But the Jewish Agricultural Society did provide help to some of them, financial help, and Alan could probably speak a lot more eloquently about that. But they were heavily financed. A lot of times it was a number of owners pooling their money together, leveraging, buying with a small amount of money down. They managed somehow. But yeah, that's a great mystery, is where did all this money come? And let's face it, some of them also were bankrolled by the gangster element that was looking to launder some of the money that they'd made from prohibition and gambling and prostitution and whatnot.
Well, John, if I may say, most of them started from small farms, chicken farms and things like that. So, I mean, they didn't need much money, and they started, getting them borders. And I think the money was like self-generated and just grew and grew and grew from there. If that makes any sense. Another thing we forget about, we talk about this all the time. When I was a kid, all the chicken farms around here. I mean, the place was, just poultry farms wherever you went. And, they became hotels.
Chicken and eggs.
Yeah.
We produced eggs. We shipped eggs all over the world at one point. We were shipping eggs to Russia and lots of places.
I remember they used to have a sign, a breadbasket of America or something, a billboard.
Billions of dozens of eggs produced here every year, and the large. There were a few handful of really large egg producers that we see them bringing in some of the. We didn't have a lot of Asian immigration into the county, but the Asians that came here, for the most part, came as a result of those large egg producers who needed to have sexers in order to optimize their financial picture.
What's a sexer, John?
Well, when you are in the business of producing eggs, Marvin, you have no control over the chickens that are born. Some are male and some are female. And if you're a large producer of eggs, the last thing you want to do is invest money in keeping alive male chickens. They have no value to you. They don't lay eggs. So it's imperative that you be able to tell the sex of a chicken as early as possible. And the problem is that there's no physical manifestation of sexuality for months with chicks, I'm told. But in Japan, they actually educated people. They had a place called the Zen Nippon University that educated sexers, that taught them how to discern the sex of the chick almost immediately upon its birth, even though there's no physical way of doing that. They just somehow knew how to do it with like 97% accuracy.
So
And-
you're saying sexer, SEXER? not
Correct, Lynn. I
censor.
could, yes, sexer.
Ah,
So when I do a program on immigration into the county, I always end by talking about sexers because people love that. You know, it has this appeal, innate appeal, I guess. And again, we only had a handful of Asian immigrants because a small farm, it didn't matter. They didn't have enough chickens where they were going to be able to recoup the salary of a full-time sexer. But if you had a large enough business, and there were a few in the county that did, you needed to have a sexer on hand to determine the sex of the chick as early as possible. And so in Monticello and Liberty, we had a few Asian families that came here because they were sexers. Alan and I went to school with the Andow family, and
yeah.
that's how they came here. And in Liberty, the Kawachi family came because the father was a sexer.
And what happened eventually to the egg business industry?
That's a good question. It died out, but I'm not sure exactly why. That's an interesting. That's a question that bears some research. Why did it die out? I'm not sure. I don't know if it was some advance in laying. I'm not sure to answer that. I can't.
And two aspects. What did they do? Destroyed the males because they didn't need them? Is that what they did?
Yeah, or they sold them off where there were people who would raise them for roasters or
Right.
But certainly the egg layers didn't want them. So yeah, a lot of them were just allowed to die. Sure.
And they kept the chicks in these huge barns with the lights on all the time. Is that right? They didn't know day from night, so
that's how you maximized laying. Yeah, it was all light dependent. Absolutely.
Right. So going back, what happened to the air conditioning, airplanes, assimilation, etc.?
Oh, so yeah, we didn't quite get to that.
No, we didn't. Although if I figure out a way to get sexers in the title of this story, I think we'll have a lot more listeners and viewers.
Exactly. Well, as I said, that's why I always end people love to hear the story about why the Jews arrived, but they much rather talk about sexers and why the Asians arrived.
Right.
Okay, so as I said, the Silver Age collapses for myriad reasons, and the same thing happens inevitably to the Golden Age. And what we hear when people talk about the collapse of the Golden Age is typically the 3 A's, as you said, Marvin: airfares, air conditioning, and assimilation. And as Alan knows, I usually add my own 2 cents of 2 additional A's. I think contributed to the demise of the Golden Age. So let's examine each of the 3 A's. So as we get into the 1960s, air conditioning in the home makes summers in the city more bearable. So we no longer see this
exodus,
this absolute necessity of leaving the city in the summer because of the oppressive heat. Airfares make traveling by airplane, I think, accessible to the everyday person. The middle class and the working class can afford to fly places on their vacation. So they no longer have to settle for a Catskills vacation. And I think assimilation, we see, as the Jewish immigrants of the 20s and 30s become assimilated, and as we move into the next generation, they no longer have to vacation around other Jewish vacationers to feel comfortable. They can go to Acapulco or Bermuda, or I don't know if Club Med existed then, but they can vacation with mainstream America. And of course, the Civil Rights Act makes it illegal to discriminate against them. So assimilation is a broad term for that. Airfares, assimilation, air conditioning, and the two additional A's that I mentioned. I think the American plan is one. I think Americans got tired of vacationing that way. Our vacation taste evolved, and the American plan becomes passé. And we were wedded here. Almost every hotel, every one of the 538 hotels in Sullivan County during the Golden Age were American plan or modified American plan. And for those of you who don't know, that's 3 meals a day come with the cost of the vacation. You pay for everything up front. Modified American plan would be you'd get 2 meals a day. And I think that American vacation taste changed. And the fifth day that I often bring up, I think the arrogance of the hotel industry and the belief that, it was just too big to fail. They didn't make adjustments. They thought that the adjustments would be made for them. There wasn't a willingness, I think, to completely abandon their business model and to start over. And I think that's what was really necessary.
Yeah, none of the hotels went clean and green with hiking trails, and there was some horseback riding, but it was very minimal.
And believe me, Marvin, I want to make it clear, and you know very well, and I owned a hotel for a very short time also. That's not an easy thing to do, as you know.
Of course.
To abandon your business model, no matter how much you're struggling, you still have an income. There's still revenue being generated, and to abandon that in the hopes that you have a better idea, it's not an easy thing to do. But in hindsight, it's easier to say that's what needed to be done.
Right.
So it's not meant as a criticism. It's just meant as an observation that there was this. It didn't happen. Let's just leave it at that.
John, at some point.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Go ahead, Lynn.
John, in its heyday, when there were these 500 plus hotels, how many local people were employed?
Well, I think it's fair to say that almost everyone in that sliver of Sullivan County that is impacted by the hotels. So we're leaving the extreme west and the extreme east of the county out, but in the central part of the county, everyone is either directly or indirectly impacted employment-wise by the hotels. So if you didn't work for the hotels, you certainly depended upon them for your income. So Marvin mentioned Kaplan's Deli. My dad owned a gas station. Without the hotels and the bungalow colonies and people buying their gas on Fridays and Sundays, how many businesses would have survived? You saw how different it was between summer and winter here. So even as we get into, as Marvin mentioned, the era of the year-round resorts. So what are we talking about? Maybe 40 or 50 hotels become year-round. That's a tiny fraction of the 538. Winters here were not nearly as lucrative as the summers in terms of all of those businesses. So probably direct employment, you're talking maybe 25% of the people in that geographic area, but in terms of direct and indirect, to 85% of the people are directly or indirectly dependent upon the hotels economically.
And at
I
some
mean, so
point,
that's important for people to understand that as the hotels started to close, then the effect that has on the local economy is it's not just the hotels closing, it's so many other related businesses that are also closing.
Absolutely. And what we see happening, Lynn, as the smaller hotels, they're the first ones to close, obviously. They're the ones that are struggling. They can't afford to make the adjustments, as we mentioned earlier, in private baths and indoor pools and whatnot. So once they begin to close, and we mentioned the Quickway. The Quickway bypasses Monticello and Liberty. So those businesses, in particularly in those two villages, which are the largest in the county by far, they begin to struggle even while those larger hotels continue to thrive, because the smaller hotels are closing. The Quickway has bypassed them, and it's a double whammy for many of those people. And then when the large hotels close and unemployment just skyrockets, that's the death knell. An already weakened economy cannot sustain that blow. So,
John, we should mention probably that one of the other things was that gaming and gambling took an awfully long time to get here. And perhaps, as we all know, Concord made the top floor of their tower a gambling facility with the tables to the point where it was destroyed. The tables were still there ready, waiting and able to do gaming, which never came. Most of the hotel, right. My granddad used to say two things we're going to get. We're going to get a monorail up Route 17 that's going to come from Broadway up to Monticello, and we're going to get gambling. He never saw either of those things. The monorail obviously didn't come, although they're still talking about adding a lane to Route 17. But gambling came way, way, way too late. And as we're finding out now, we don't know what the future of gambling. We do have gambling, and it appears to be doing well or okay. But now that they're talking about adding gaming into New York City, we don't know what that's going to do for us. So that would have been a factor in the demise as well. John, let's mention a couple of other things in the time that we have left. One is the airport. At some point, we put that in because that was expected to be a big help to the industry, and a convention center, which never materialized. And then, of course, there was the college and the internecine carrying on for the location of the school that delayed its placement in the county for many, a decade maybe, perhaps. After the Governor Rockefeller said every county should have a community college. So if you want to touch on either one of those, that would be helpful for people who don't know the history.
I think each one of those could probably be a topic in and of itself, or maybe we could spend an hour talking about them. But the one thing that I think people miss about those when discussing those topics is what they have in common. Is the government of the county at the time was the Board of Supervisors. And, I think I hear very often in the political realm these days how much we need to return to the Board of Supervisors as a form of government. And I would just point out that it was a massive failure. And I think those, the airport and the college in particular, are examples of how the Board of Supervisors delayed the implementation of those, and the convention center, which never happened, got kicked around as political footballs because and this is not a criticism of the individual supervisors, it was the system put them in a no-win situation because they were the chief executive officers of their towns by nature of the position of being supervisor. And then they were also expected to serve as legislators on the county level. But their first allegiance, and rightfully so, was always to their individual towns. And so what would benefit the county was typically put on the back burner with each of the supervisors who were looking out for their towns. And so the battle over where to locate the airport, the battle over where to locate the college, delayed the eventual construction of those institutions for many, many years beyond where it should have been. And I think it was largely because of the form of government that we had here. That was the great failing of the Board of Supervisors. It was just not a good way of governing the county. It set up an impossible dilemma for each of the supervisors. And I think the college and the fight that went over and all of the other issues that were impacted by the college, the location of the college. During the time period between the time that the college was granted to the county and the time that a permanent site was decided upon, almost every issue in the county was tainted by the fight over where to locate the college. There were deals being made constantly that hinged on the eventual site of the college. And to a lesser extent, the airport was the same kind of a thing. Of course, the airport, like the Raceway, was a product of the hotel owners. They thought that was something that was needed to save their business, and the county went out on a limb, invested public money to try to save the hotels in an ill-advised move, and the airport was kind of a debacle from the beginning. When it opened in 1969, I think in the first 5 years they went through 4 operators because no one could make a living, as operating the airport in Sullivan County.
You mentioned the magic date, John, as we're winding down, 1969. 2 things happened in 69, among others. One was the landing on the moon by the US, which was very helpful to us in the space race and in the Cold War. But more importantly, it was Woodstock.
Oh, I thought you were going to say the Miracle Mets.
That too, but we'll put that on the side. As it impacts our county, what did Woodstock do that in some ways put us on the map, but didn't have a long-term beneficial effect in bringing people back to the county? Although here it is, 50 years later, we're still celebrating it. And of course, we're not.
We're not still celebrating it. We're beginning to celebrate it. Because as
Okay.
you know, Marvin, for years and years, and Lynn can attest to this, we wanted to separate ourselves from Woodstock. We didn't celebrate it. Meanwhile, the village of Woodstock in Ulster County was making hay with the association of the name. You saw television commercials that implied that great music festival was held there, and they were selling pieces of earth from the village of Woodstock because people thought it had something to do with the music festival, when the connection was rather indirect, if at all. So that was our own fault that we didn't capitalize on Woodstock. From the mass gathering laws that followed almost immediately upon the closing of the festival, the political ramifications of it, how many music festivals that were proposed in the aftermath that were, never took place because they were precluded either by law or by public outcry from taking place. And for many, many years, the site went, unappreciated. People were blocked in many cases from visiting, whether by chicken manure spread on the site or snow plows blocking access. And, this is kind of the dark side of our history. And I dare say that if it wasn't for our good friend Alan Gary stepping in. If it had been anyone else who owned that property, I don't think we'd be celebrating Woodstock to this day. But when Alan, because of who he was and because of the cachet that he had created by being a self-made man and keeping his billions here in the county and building his national headquarters here and whatnot, and the goodwill that all of that brought with it. When he decided that Woodstock was something that could be celebrated and utilized to revive our economy, people said, okay, if Alan Gary says so, then it must be okay. Marvin, if that was you or me who had purchased the site, people wouldn't be behind celebrating Woodstock any more than they were 40 years ago.
Yeah, two things. One, Alan was not only wise and well off, but he respected the history of Woodstock and chose not to put the festival site on the ground that was sacred and which housed the actual performance on one side of the hill, and put the Bethel Performing Arts Center on the other side. Right. So people still come and visit the sacred ground where that took place. And of course,
let's also not lose sight of the fact that he had very good advisors, and that one of the best things about Alan Gary is, he hired the best and the brightest, and he had people who advised him that it was better to have 3 attractions than 1. And tourism is all about synergy, Marvin, and so now he had the synergy of the original site, the museum, and the performing arts venue. So he had 3 attractions. You're absolutely right.
And just if we could, as we're closing down, to end on a positive note, in my opinion, going to Bethel Woods is such a wonderful experience for a lot of reasons. One, it's world-class talent that's coming to us. We don't have to drag to New York or Chicago or Long Island or wherever. And 2 is, it's the friendliest place in the county. We've always had a reputation of not being as friendly with out-of-towners as we could have been, especially in the hotel business. If you didn't come to my hotel, I'm not interested in you. And, and even when we worked in town, we tried our best to be friendly. But the people and the volunteers at Bethel Woods, if I may say so, for those who are listening who haven't been, they could not be more friendly, more accommodating, nicer, more welcoming to the virtually tens of thousands, maybe even approaching, God knows, hundreds of thousands over the years to come to our county. So if we're going to end on a positive note, that's certainly one where there's just win-win. And every blade of grass is beautiful and perfect. The walkways and the byways and the bathrooms and the seats and the comfort level. It's just incredible. So we'll put in a plug for Bethel Woods here and invite anybody who's listening to come see the wonderful art, the music, and the pleasure that you can experience here in Sullivan County.
And again, I think that a lot of that is Alan's doing, Marvin. He would settle for nothing less than that. And who knows where we'd be without that? Because when Bethel Woods opened, there was nothing else here, or very little else here. And as Alan has often said, he was able to keep the lights on until things got moving again. And I think it was in many ways the impetus for getting things moving again. And that's an additional legacy that Bethel Woods has, is that it ignited a lot of other growth. Just as gambling did. In and of itself, gambling has had a minor impact, I think, but it did ignite a lot of other growth. It brought interest here. It brought economic activity, and it spurred a lot of other projects that have, gotten underway since gambling arrived. So,
and since the pandemic, which is obviously a major negative, created a positive here in the county. I mean, the home sales, the second homes since the pandemic has been right through the roof and off the charts. Everybody you talked to said every available home has been purchased in the past number of years, and that's a big plus for the county and for our community. So we've got a lot more city folks like the old days coming up here. And the traffic on the Quickway is almost like the 50s again on a
Yeah.
weekend or even on a weekday. It's amazing how many cars there are. So come on up. The weather's fine. And we're going to have a beautiful Holiday Mountain skiing area this year that Mike Taylor's redoing.
That's
and they're
exciting.
putting in state-of-the-art equipment, and it's going to be probably a world-class facility. Even though we don't have the highest hills in the area, they're going to be hopefully very welcoming as well. John, anything you want to end on?
Can I just add one thing, Marvin? And once
Sure.
again, the Holiday Mountain project, like the Woodstock project, is a hometown person staying here, investing in here, and helping us thrive. And I think I'm hopeful that that's another good sign.
Yeah, I agree 100%.
Here, here. John, anything else you want to end on before we say thank you again?
You know, again, Marvin, I think once we delve into these topics, we realize how much depth there is to all of them. And, you know, many of them could be the subject of an entire hour by themselves. So there's so much left untouched that I'm sure we can do this again at some point until
Great.
you get tired of looking at me.
No, you're invited. We'll try and set that up and pick out a couple of more topics or
Still lots left to talk about.
Embellish the ones we have. Again, thank you, John Conway, Sullivan County historian, for helping us walk through the decades from 1900 until really the 21st century, and how the community has thrived, gone through economic cycles, and come back again. We thank you for your time, your energy, your care, your concern. We love your books and your programs, and we look forward to hearing from you again.
Good to see you all, and thanks again for the opportunity. I appreciate it.
Thanks, John. Thanks a lot.
John.
Great, always. Great.
Okay. Let's see.
And thank you, Marvin. Thanks a lot. And Lynn.